I finished Pragmata in 20 hours. I didn't rush through it. I found most of the collectibles, completed every training session except one, spent time with the shelter system, and saw the story through to the end. And by the time the credits rolled, my rating for this game was clear. Pragmata is worth playing. Not because it is massive, not because it is especially difficult, not because it tries to overwhelm you with skill. It is worth playing because it understands what matters most. On the surface, this is a sci-fi action game about shooting hostile machines, hacking weak points, surviving a lunar facility, and trying to find a way back to Earth. And all of that matters. The combat has a real identity. The hacking gives encounters a rhythm that feels different from a normal third-person shooter. The progression makes the game more enjoyable the longer it goes. But the part that stayed with me the most was not the shooting, it was Hugh and Diana, a stranded engineer and a childlike AI. Two characters who begin as a practical partnership, then slowly become something much more personal. That is where Pragmata works best. You play as Hugh Williams, a Delphi systems engineer sent to a lunar research station called the Cradle after something goes wrong. The station is tied to Luna filament, a material capable of replicating almost anything as long as it has the right data. By the time Hugh and his team arrive, the situation is already collapsing. A lunar quake tears through the facility, communications with Earth are cut off, Hugh is separated from his team, the AI system controlling the station, EDIS, begins treating people as trespassers. Hugh is injured, alone, and trapped inside a facility that has turned against him. Then Diana finds him. She is a Pragmata, a young AI girl created through Luna filament. When you first encounter her, she doesn't really have a name, she goes by a serial number. Hugh gives her the name Diana, and from there the story becomes less about one man escaping a hostile moon base and more about the bond forming between him and the child he never expected to protect.
I said I am DI0.
Okay. Look, how about we call you Diana?
Diana?
Yeah, from now on you can be Diana.
That part worked on me almost immediately. I have a daughter in real life, so I may be more sensitive to this kind of story. The second Diana entered the picture, I felt protective of her. But what impressed me is that the game does not make her annoying, helpless, or overly precious. She is curious, she is observant, she is still learning what the world is, and she is useful. Diana is not just there to give the story emotional weight during cutscenes, she is part of how the game plays. Hugh handles the physical side of combat. He moves, shoots, dodges, jumps, survives, and takes the direct risk. Diana handles the hacking. Against armored enemies, Hugh's weapons only become truly effective once Diana opens them up. When she hacks an enemy, its armor enters an open state, exposing weak points that Hugh can punish before the window closes. The fight never pauses while this happens. Enemies are still moving, projectiles keep coming. Something can close the distance while your attention is buried in the hacking matrix. So every encounter asks you to divide your focus. You are solving Diana's side of the fight while keeping Hugh alive in the arena. Not just shooting, not just hacking, both at once. Early on, that loop is pretty straightforward. You open enemies, shoot the weak points, manage your spacing, and avoid unnecessary damage because healing is limited. You heal with repair canisters, not passive recovery, so mistakes have some weight. The shooting also feels good from the beginning. Blasting enemies has satisfying feedback, and Hugh's movement felt smoother and more responsive to me than it did in the demo. But the early combat does have some friction. For the first stretch, I relied on the pistol more than I wanted to. Secondary weapons like the shotgun are powerful, but they have limited ammo. You burn through them quickly, and once they are empty, they are gone until you find or craft another. The shotgun especially felt restrictive early on because it only had a handful of shots, and every reload made missed opportunities feel heavier. The pistol is your dependable fallback, but it also has a slower reload rhythm because it loads rounds individually. That meant that some early fights had this stop-start feeling where I was waiting for the weapon to catch up with the pace of the encounter. Don't get me wrong, combat was still fun, it just felt like the game was holding back its better tools. Around the middle of the campaign, that starts to change. You gain the ability to carry 2 weapons from each category, even though you cannot carry 2 of the exact same weapons. That alone makes a huge difference because you're no longer falling back to the primary weapon quite as quickly. The pistol is also eventually replaced by the pulse carbine, which functions more like a default rifle and gives you a much larger magazine to work with. That was the moment the gunplay started to feel more complete, not transformed into a different game, just less restricted, more willing to let me use the stronger tools instead of saving them for some future encounter that might never come. The hacking side grows in a similar direction. At first, the hacking matrix is mostly about opening enemies so you can deal real damage. Later, the game adds more layers through hacks, hacking modes, heat, and critical shots. Heat builds as you attack enemies, and once the heat bar fills, they become staggered, opening them up for a critical shot. Against regular enemies, that can feel almost like an execution. You can also change your hacking mode, which adds special squares to the matrix. Offense mode can add extra damage, combust mode builds heat faster, and there are 2 more that you can unlock. These are not massive changes on their own, but they make the hacking feel more active because your route through the matrix starts to carry more purpose. That is the most important thing about Pragmata's progression. It does not suddenly become a different game halfway through, it becomes a fuller version of itself. You're still dodging, still hacking, still shooting weak points, still managing enemies in compact spaces, but the game keeps adding just enough weapons, hacks, modes, and enemy behaviors to keep the loop from going flat. The difficulty follows that same curve. For the first few sectors, I would not call Pragmata difficult. I did not die for a while. My first death actually came during the boss at the end of Sector 3, the Garden Keeper. That fight was more aggressive than the earlier bosses, especially because of a tail swap you have to watch for carefully and either jump over or stay out of range. Even then, that fight was more fun than punishing. That stayed true for most of the campaign. The bosses have interesting design and mechanics, but I rarely found them especially threatening. One is more of a traditional mech, another has a scorpion or spider-like shape, another reminded me of a giant sandworm. They are visually distinct and each one has its own ideas. But if you're looking for a game that constantly pushes you to the edge, Pragmata is probably not that. Most of the tension comes from regular encounters, especially once the game starts putting multiple enemies in front of you at the same time. Usually, you're fighting in enclosed rooms or arena-like spaces where 3 or 4 enemies can pressure you at once. That is where the dual-layer design becomes more demanding. You're dodging attacks, watching projectiles, trying to find enough space to open the matrix, deciding which enemy to hack first, and then capitalizing before the open window closes. Later enemy types also become more aggressive, which makes hacking harder to do safely. Some enemies ask for more specific responses too. There are missile-firing robots, for example. You can dodge their missiles, but you can also hack them and send them back for heavy damage. That kind of interaction gives combat more texture because the answer is not always just to shoot more. So I would not describe Pragmata as punishing. You do have to engage with the systems, you do have to hack, you do have to move, you do have to manage pressure, but it is more about steady multitasking than brutal mastery. That fits the broader shape of the game. Pragmata has 6 sectors and the campaign is mostly linear. You move from one part of the facility to the next, pushing deeper through the station as Hugh and Diana try to restore systems, communicate with Earth, and figure out what really happened. This is not an open world game and is not trying to be, but the linear spaces are not empty hallways either. There are side rooms, hidden corners, collectibles, currencies, vertical spaces, holographic walls, and optional rest zone areas that require keys that warn you before sending you into a tougher encounter for better rewards. I enjoyed that balance. The game keeps you moving forward, but it still rewards curiosity. There are also training sessions, time challenge rooms tied to the shelter. They start simple, but they give useful rewards, and I found myself enjoying them more than I expected. I completed all of them except one, and while I would not call them a major pillar of the game, they add a good optional layer between main progression and upgrades. The shelter itself is one of the most important spaces in Pragmata. Mechanically, it is your hub. This is where you manage upgrades, prepare gear, interact with systems like the firmware updater to upgrade your armor, the unit printer to choose your loadout, and many other things. This is where your progression becomes organized. Emotionally, it is where the game slows down and lets Diana become more than a combat mechanic. This is where you bring Earth memories back to her. These are these drives that have data from objects from Earth that you can use Luna filament to recreate back in the shelter. Crayons, a water gun, a slide, things that seem ordinary to Hugh but feel new and strange to Diana. Those moments are where the story is at its strongest. Not in long cutscenes, not in constant dramatic reveals, Pragmata does not actually have a huge number of cutscenes, and for the first half of the game, the larger plot stays fairly simple. Hugh and Diana are trying to survive, restore systems, and find a way home. But every time I brought something back to Diana, I wanted to see how she would react. That surprised me because in a lot of games, companion dialogue can eventually become noise. With Diana, I never felt that. I wanted to hear what she thought, I wanted to see what an object meant to her, I wanted to watch her experience the world for the first time. Diana has this innocent curiosity that reminded me of childhood before ordinary things become ordinary. When a simple object can still feel strange, when the world still feels large, when learning what something is also means learning how it feels to live with it. And Hugh becomes the person guiding her through that. He is one of the reasons the relationship works.
I was an orphan, so at dinner with my new family, just having someone that listened was magical. It was all kid stuff, but they were always there.
Hugh is not written as a bitter man using a child companion to heal some obvious wound. He was an orphan, but he was adopted by a good family. He speaks about them with warmth. He has traveled, made choices, and seems to understand that people are imperfect without losing faith in them. That makes him feel different. He is not protecting Diana because the story needs him to rediscover his humanity. He already has that, and what he gives Diana is his belief in it. Diana is a blank slate in a dangerous place. If someone cruel had found her, she could have become something very different. But Hugh finds her, Hugh names her, Hugh teaches her, and he treats her like a person even when the world around them keeps reminding you that she's an AI. That relationship carries the quieter first half. Later, the larger mystery does become more interesting. The game starts revealing more about the station, the Pragmata androids, the staff, and what has been happening beneath the surface. I don't want to go too deep into that because those later reveals are better left intact. But the story does shift from a simple escape premise into something more tragic, more human, and more tied to the consequences of trying to use technology to solve pain it may never have been able to solve. It's not the most complex story, but it landed, and it landed because the game had already made me care about Hugh and Diana before the bigger answers arrived. The presentation helps carry that as well. At first glance, Pragmata has the clean, sterile NASA-like identity you would expect from a lunar research facility. Metal corridors, machines, artificial spaces, but Luna Filament allows the station to recreate environments from Earth, and that gives the game more visual variety than I expected. One sector takes you through a fake version of New York City, another moves through an overgrown Terra Dome where vegetation has taken over and giant roots reshape the environment. There is even a recreated beach sunset with water that is only a hologram. Later, you step onto the moon's surface itself, with the station visible around you and Earth hanging in the distance. Even when the game changes environments, you never fully forget where you are. The artificial structure remains underneath everything. That contrast gives the station a strange identity. Part research facility, part memory of Earth, part machine trying to imitate life. Now when it comes to the technical side of things, my experience was strong. I played on a 3080 Ti and I was able to run the game with most settings maxed while staying above 60 FPS. Now I can only speak about my experience with my setup, so I'm not speaking for every PC configuration, but for me, performance was not a problem. By the time I finished, my playthrough came in at around 20 hours. Again, I didn't rush through it. I found most collectibles, completed nearly every training session, spent time with the optional systems, and I still reached the end without the game overstaying its welcome. For this type of game, I think that's a solid length. It gives the combat enough time to grow, it gives Hugh and Diana enough time to matter, it gives the story enough space to reveal itself. But it does not stretch those systems until they start to wear thin, and there is more to it after the credits. Finishing the game unlocks New Game Plus, where you can start again using your completed save file while carrying over most of your gear, upgrades, resources, outfits, database entries, music, mini cabins, and other collected progress. You also unlock Lunatic difficulty, a harder mode with stronger enemies and new weapon upgrade considerations. There is also Unknown Signal, post-campaign content tied to your completed save, not something you need to start a New Game Plus for. It adds extra post-game content including Simpod challenges and rewards. Beating the story also unlocks a unique outfit for Hugh and Diana along with a new weapon. I would not frame this as a massive endgame, that is not what Pragmata is, but I appreciate that the game gives you a reason to return, especially if you enjoyed the combat and want a harder run. Now, Pragmata is not flawless. The early weapon restrictions can make combat feel more limited than it eventually becomes. Some bosses are more visually interesting than mechanically threatening. The game is mostly linear, which may be a negative if you are expecting broad exploration, and the story takes time before its larger mystery really starts to move. But none of that broke the experience for me because Pragmata has a clear identity. It's a focused sci-fi action game built around partnership. Hugh and Diana are not just a story pairing, they are the structure of the combat, the reason the shelter matters, and the emotional thread that gives the campaign its shape. The shooting is satisfying, the hacking creates real pressure, the progression makes combat better over time, the world has enough variety to keep the journey moving, and at the center of it all is a relationship that feels sincere enough to carry the quieter stretches. That's why I believe that this game is worth playing. It's not a masterpiece, not a game I would recommend to absolutely everyone without caveats, but a game I'm glad I played, and one I think deserves attention from people who want a sci-fi action adventure with more heart than the premise might suggest. Because when I think back on Pragmata, I do not first think about the biggest boss, the strongest weapon, or the late game twist. I think about Diana discovering something ordinary from Earth and treating it like a miracle. I think about Hugh watching her become more than the thing she was made to be. And I think about a game that understood something simple but important. Survival means more when there is someone beside you worth protecting.